Hello. I'm not sure I know how to help you. The older I get, the closer I have to be. Got it, go. I couldn't sleep good enough to sleep. Yeah, now you're ready.
I go up there and try to get that's what I
Oh.
All right, it's good to see everybody today. I was cold earlier, but now that I've run all over the church looking for a remote, I'm not. There we go. All right, we have some changes this week, mainly from the online crowd. They said they couldn't read anything on the screen. It was a small TV, so we have a bigger TV. And also, we changed the font and everything. So we're going for bigger words. That's right. Well, it's good to see everyone, to have you back. We had a good crowd last week, and looks like it's held this week as well as we continue. We do have a few books back there, so if you're wanting a book, you can grab one. It's by donation only. We've changed that policy over the last few years. We're trying to follow the law. As a church, we want to follow the law. And you can turn around. That's good.
How do you turn it around?
Dana Walton is laughing at you.
Top right. Okay.
There you go. You can shake it up.
Okay.
It's good to have help. That would be a fun video to watch. Wouldn't matter what font I chose. You wouldn't be able to see it. So churches are tax exempt, but if we're buying a book that then you buy from us, that book is not tax exempt, and you would have to pay taxes on it. And so we can offer books where you make a donation, and you're going to ask me, well, what should the donation be? And by law, I can't tell you, because that would be me selling you the book. So you can always look things up online and figure out what a good, donation would be. So anyway. All right, so we are covering chapters 2 and 3 and 4 tonight. Today. Whew. Let's take a deep breath. Running up and down the stairs is not a great way to start a Bible study. If you weren't here last week, we're covering this book, What is a Christian Anyway? It's based on the Nicene Creed, which in the early church, you've probably more heard of the Apostles' Creed. If you go to a church that recites the creed, or you've heard that before, more than likely it's the Apostles' Creed that you heard recited. But the Nicene Creed is an expansion of that. It happened in the 300s. It really was addressing what we'll get into next week is kind of the bulk of the Nicene Creed, when we're really talking about who is Jesus. That is the question that was predominantly answering, but this week we're not quite there yet. So last week was just sort of a talk about creeds, the role they've played in the life of the church, how most Baptists claim to not be creedal, but that doesn't mean we don't believe what the creeds say. We just tend to use them in church life in a different way than other denominations do. But it still serves as a wonderful consensus document for us with other believers. So what do Christians and what have Christians throughout the ages believed? And so he starts this chapter. It's interesting. He grew up not a Christian, but a Hindu. And his family came to faith, really his father later. And so, belief there, especially when you convert from one faith to another, that's a big deal. And so you are going to think more deeply about what is it that I'm believing versus what I used to believe. He talks about, and I've experienced this in other parts of the world, that in the West, we tend to think of belief as something that's private, something in here. We don't even always talk about our beliefs. We talked about that book we did, this is like 3 summers ago, on sharing your faith, how in America it's okay to talk about your faith in private settings, but in public spheres, there's no law against talking about our faith, but kind of cultural norms are, you save that for private spaces. We don't talk about that in public spaces. But that's not the case if you go to other parts of the world. Allison's sister was a missionary in the Far East, and while we were over there visiting her, very often houses would have shrines out there on the front porch or on the corner of the property, depending on what particular faith they were. Faith was just a very public part of life, and he talks about that. And so for us, when we come to the creeds as Western people, we often think of them in purely individualistic terms of, do I believe, in kind of an intellectual exercise inside my heart, all of the things that this is about to say. But that's not the way the creeds really were originally used, because they weren't originally formulated in individualistic cultures. We are one of the most individualistic cultures in the world. When we think about our hero stories are very often the people who leave their families, leave their communities of origin, change their beliefs, and do something else, even though it costs them all of kind of their historic relationships. When you think of hero stories in the West, that's often the kind of stories that we tell. Now, if you tell that same story in other cultures that are more community-based, you know what they would call our hero?
Traitor.
Yeah, a traitor, a villain. They have shirked the community. And so, but we're so immersed in this that I think a lot of times we don't understand quite how individualistic we are. So he even uses this phrase, I know that, versus we believe in. And he kind of contrasts these. Right off the bat, you know a difference in pronouns. So I versus we. In fact, in America, if you talk about, well, we believe this, somebody was saying, I don't care what your group believes. What do you believe? And we center it in on that. But we're going to talk in a second about why it's important. And really, all of us have community beliefs, whether we realize it or not. And we'll talk about that in just a second. It just depends. We may not define our community real well, but all of us have beliefs that are shaped by whatever community we think is most important. And so, and then knowing versus believing. So we live in a kind of scientific age. We think that you can know things with certainty, and there are some things you can know with certainty, but there are all sorts of other things that you can't know with certainty. And actually, that we're going to talk about in a second, the most important things in life are not actually the things we can know with certainty. Stick with me on that. If you don't believe me, just hold on. We'll get there. And then that versus in. So this kind of objective, propositional, I know this piece of information over there, versus this idea that it's something that's actually going to be embodied in my life. And so that kind of sets up the juxtaposition. He really talks about the creed is not a cold doctrinal statement. The aim is not for us to simply mentally assent to a bunch of propositions. The goal is actually to know and engage the God of whom the creed speaks. That's the aim. And that's for church too, right? With church, we have a lot of information, but the goal of church and worship is not just to fill our heads with information, it's actually to worship and love God. That's all relational language, isn't it? And so he gets there. So we're going to talk a little bit more about individual versus community. I found this clip art and it really works well, because really you should have one little guy and a bunch of other little guys. But for our culture, this really helps us see where's the pull. We got one big giant guy pulling for individuality and one person pulling for community. And here's the thing, it's very easy for us, especially as church people, to badmouth individuality. That's not the goal here. There's a great sermon by the late Timothy Keller. It's on Wheaton College's YouTube. So if you go search Our Identity, the Christian Alternative to Late Modernity's Story, it's one of the greatest, I know that's a mouthful. So just do this. Timothy Keller, Wheaton College, Identity. It will get you to the right place, okay? And Timothy Keller, one of the most brilliant minds of really the last generation, just recently passed away a couple years ago of pancreatic cancer. He really talks about how do we form our identity. That's one of the big discussions of our culture right now, isn't it? Everybody talks about identity. I identify as this, I identify as that. All of these things, and identity seems to be up for grab. And he talks about how we shape our identity, especially in our very individualistic culture. But he starts off by saying, we don't want to badmouth individuality too bad, because individuality, this idea that the individual matters, is actually a Christian doctrine. We covered that doctrine on Sunday. Every single one of us is what? Made in the image of God. Without that doctrine, you don't actually have individual rights. You could live in societies where the community totally consumes the individual. None of us want to live in that kind of world, do we? where we don't have any say, where the community gets to say everything over our lives. But we do know individuality can go to an extreme. And we really live in that place. And so he talks about how we think that we find ourselves, or we discover ourselves, or we create an identity from within ourselves. And he talks about there's a lot of reasons why this just doesn't work. And we see this. We live in a day and age where for generations now, we've been telling young people, you get to determine who you are. And that sounds good, but of course, we now have a generation of young people that have more mental illness than any generation before them. And some of that's technology, but it's really technology combined with this idea that it's up to me to shape my identity. And this is going to kind of give us a reason for why, not just the creed, but what the creed represents, our faith, is so important. Is you can't actually come up with a coherent identity all on your own. One of the reasons he says, lots of times we think, well, it's just my feelings. My feelings determine my identity. So if I feel a certain way or I have certain thoughts, those direct my identity. He says the trouble with this is, one, our feelings and our thoughts are incoherent. They're not all the same. They're not even consistent. So this idea of I want to do this and I want to do that, and even those two desires are contradictory. He even uses, the idea not everything I desire is good. So, I always make this joke that you'd have the commercials online. They're really public service announcements about don't shake the baby. And before you have babies, you think, why would you ever need to tell somebody don't shake a baby? And then you have a baby and you're like, oh, I remember, I should not shake this baby, though I want to shake them right now if that would help them be quiet. Right? We know we have aggression inside of us. We have bitterness inside of us, just as we have joy and all sorts of other things. And so if we're just trying to figure out what inside of us is going to shape our identity, we're going to have to make some choices, aren't we? Because our inside, it's all us. My aggression is a part of me. Is that going to shape my identity? So we all have to make choices. And he says, really, all of us are shaped by, our choices are shaped by our culture, whether we realize it or not. So he says, in an ancient world, if you had a guy, Anglo-Saxon, medieval period, their culture, shame and honor culture, you have really, your community survives based upon the fact that you have more strong people than the community down the road. And so strength is a value of that community. And so he has this deep aggression inside of him. He's actually good at bashing people's brains out. He likes it. And his community says to him, what? That is a value to be lifted up. And so he says, I'm going to do that. Now, we still have a lot of those same aggressions inside of us. But if I live in a big urban center like this, somebody cuts me off on the freeway, I think I would really like to bash their brains in right now. But our culture, we at least hope for a little longer, says what? I shouldn't do that. And so I'm actually taking those desires and I'm pushing them down and saying, that's not a desire I want to live out. And we can do, right? So you have changing sexual mores through different cultures, all sorts of different things where we seem to want to say, our culture, my individual desires are king, but nobody can live in which all of their desires are king because our desires are conflicting. Therefore, we all have to make choices. Which desires will I elevate? And so all of us are filtering our desires through something else to decide which desires will I make for me. And so he says, really, this leads to, even if we could admit that, it's still this crushing burden that I have to create my own identity. And really, I think that's a lot of the mental health problems of our young people, is we live in this world where everybody thinks they have to have the most spectacular life ever. Right? So social media, you look at it, all your influencers, everybody else, it's as if they live this, it's like a magazine. Like in the old days, we did have magazines, and magazines would present life as like you go get Better Homes and Gardens, and you think that's beautiful. But most of us, when we would get those magazines, we would just look at our regular house, and we would think, regular people don't live like that, right? We don't have to have a house like that. Alice and I joked that our wedding was a pre-Pinterest wedding. Okay? So some of you who got married a generation ahead of us honestly, our wedding didn't look that much different probably than yours. It wasn't a huge affair. We had nice food and stuff, but it was still pretty tame. We weren't overboard on directions. Nobody was going to take pictures of our wedding and think, well, that looks like something I saw in Brides magazine. It just wasn't going to be, right? Reception was at the church, all those kind of things. Allison's sister got married post Pinterest, and her wedding looked like it could have been in a magazine when you take all the pictures and all those things, and that's the world we live in. But here's the trouble: can every moment of every life be lived like it should qualify for a magazine? No, and yet we live with this sort of expectation that I have to shape an identity that looks like that. And Keller says that's utterly crushing, especially when that burden falls on me. Now, it's true. We don't live in a world, I'm glad we don't live in a world, this is borrowing his idea, where if my dad was a blacksmith, I have to be a blacksmith, and my kid has to be a blacksmith. I'm glad we live in a world where there's some individualness. But also we live in this world where we just give everybody this blank page, and blank pages are hard to fill if you have to come up with it all on your own. And that's what we're saying to people, is you got to do this all on your own, no help. But instead, the best thing comes from meaning that's shaped by community. Our identities change over time. He talks about, we think about a marriage. If my marriage has to look like something that would be on Instagram every day of my life, in a way that other people look at it and say, I wish I had what they had. Can your marriage live up to that? No, so in that sense, it's crushing. You can't live up to that. But even if you can, what you're really basing your identity on is my life is better than everybody else's. As opposed to, what does it mean to be married? What does it mean to be committed to one another? We change over time. So, right, my desires, but what keeps that marriage consistent are vows that we have entered into a relationship. We've made promises to one another, and those promises are going to dictate the way we interact with each other for the rest of our life. It's going to give us meaning. He talks about the fact that we change over time. So our individualness, we change. We're not exactly the same. Allison says, I didn't marry somebody who loves to take pictures of butterflies. That wasn't on my resume when we got married, okay? And she's had to adapt to that, and she has. So we go to look at Anne of Green Gables and do that, and while we're there, she finds places for me to go look at butterflies, and it works. But if you had told us on that stuff on the front end, we might have been like, I don't know if I want to sign up for that, That sounds kind of like I'm marrying a nerd. She knew she was marrying a nerd, she just didn't know how much of a nerd she was marrying. But the promise is what defines that for us. We've made promises to each other. And so now I don't have to create meaning in myself. The external promise helps provide the meaning. And because there's constraints, it's not as overwhelming, right? It's one of the great paradoxes of our culture, is that we have this kind of complete freedom to do whatever, but that freedom leads to a kind of enslavement to I have to create meaning for myself, which is really hard. Whereas if we have constraints, and what we're going to talk about, the constraints of a believing community that says this is what we believe, those constraints actually serve us well because they mean we don't have to invent a life whole cloth. We're already given an idea of what life is to look like. And so that brings us to that. And so Paul really picks up on this. Also love that he gets a whole chapter out of we believe in, but we're going to go with it. He says, and we read this last week, I want to remind you of the gospel that I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. So again, do we have to make up, as Christians, do we make up what we believe? Whole cloth. No, what do we receive it? And it's actually very helpful to know that what we are receiving is the same thing that Christians have been receiving from the very beginning. In fact, there's a movement, we always talk about contemporary churches, contemporary music, want everything to be brand new. That's cultural for us. That's this idea that, I know pastors that they get to be about my age, and they're like, if you don't make your last move by the time you're 50, you won't get hired anymore. That's kind of the actual statements among pastors these days. That once you're older than 50, that's it. Most down. How's that strike you?
Pretty much.
Yeah, for everywhere. But there's an emptiness to that, isn't there? Right? And we live in a culture where it's everything is new, and these days everything is new every moment of every day. And there is a recognition among many people in our world that that leads to just a total emptiness. There's no content. And in fact, there are young people, the vast majority of young people are simply leaving church altogether. But those who are seeking to stay in church, there's actually a movement from, say, evangelical churches, which have a good history, but people just don't recognize it. There's a lot of folks going to Roman Catholicism. There's a lot of folks going to Eastern Orthodoxy, certain Reformed traditions, because they perceive it to be more grounded in history. In a world that's ever changing, people are looking for things that have more consistency. And the Nicene Creed goes a long ways back. And so it is one of the ways the early church has expressed what is it that we have received? What's the content of the gospel? And so that's part of the we. He picks up on this later in the believe, but I think it goes better with the we. Friends, every week when we show up to church, we are part of the we that goes all the way back to the book of Acts. So when we say we believe, it's not something we just made up this week. I didn't sit in my office and go, what profound new thing am I going to say about God this week? The good news is I don't actually have to say anything new about God. We have received something. And what we are called to do is to pass on what we have received. Now, there's always a fresh presentation of it, but it's not a new gospel. It is the same old gospel. Then he also talks about that in the context of staying in the boat. This might have caused a couple of you some questions here. So he talks about people who have doubt. So especially in traditions where you have to stand up and say the creed. We don't do this as Baptists, so you don't have to cross your fingers. But you got folks who stand. Even C.S. Lewis talks about this when he was coming to Christianity, and he might be in a worship service, and he doesn't believe everything they're saying. And so it's like, do you remain silent? Some people say it, cross their fingers, they talk about this. But is this idea that our faith is individual. We as Baptists emphasize this, but it's not our faith alone. We are joining a community of faith. And if we have questions, if we have doubts, that actually it's the staying in with the community, even during those questions, that can help us move through those seasons of doubt to a deeper and richer belief. Alice and I have experienced this on a more kind of intimate level, not doubts. I got to really move on this. I'm just going to have trouble getting through this today. You know, our first marriage, our first pregnancy ended in miscarriage. Some of you have heard this story. And so deep grief, that's always deep grief if any pregnancy ends in miscarriage. But your first one also comes with all the questions of, is this going to be what's going to be like for us? All those things, deep, deep grief. And because we're church people, I think we missed one Sunday, but the very next Sunday now we're back at our church. I wasn't the pastor. We were just attending this church. And frankly, you get ready to sing, you get ready to do all those things, and because of the depth of our grief, we really couldn't get out the songs. I don't speak for Allison. I couldn't get out the songs. But because I consider myself a part of God's church, it really was kind of the quiet prayer of my heart. Lord, I cannot sing these songs today, but please accept the songs of my brothers and sisters on my behalf. That is itself an act of faith. We too often think people have to have these kind of Superman levels of assurance about everything. But just showing up and saying, God, I don't understand everything. I don't even like everything. Even you may say, I don't even know if I believe everything, but I believe enough that I'm here with these people because I believe you have the answers to life, even if I don't. I can remember in college, I was taking a New Testament class from the state of Texas at Texas A&M University. And of course, they didn't teach it like Sunday school. And so I went to my college pastor and I started asking him all these questions. And he just looked at me and said, we're not supposed to ask those kind of questions. Which I thought, well, that's not helpful at all. And I found a different church. And in fact, seminary was a wonderful place for me because you got to ask those questions. And you got to dig a little deeper, but in a place that was committed to the gospel. And so the questions weren't pushed away. They really said, yeah, let's think about this more deeply. Let's think about this in the context of faith. But it's in the boat, right? You're allowed to do it in the boat, and the boat itself helps carry you along on the journey of faith. Well, as we move on, I got to keep moving, sorry. How would you differentiate between facts and beliefs? How would you define a fact?
That has evidence.
There's evidence, certainty. A fact is perhaps something we can be certain about.
Fact is a thing that is actually true of reality. A belief is my understanding of reality.
Yeah, so that's probably a good Western way of thinking of it. So we have a fact is something that it's true, it's verifiably true. A belief may or may not be true. And maybe we can't verify it at all. That's one of the challenges of belief, we'll see. Which do you think is more significant? We just said, what would you rather have, a bunch of facts or a bunch of beliefs?
We have to have beliefs because some of this we can't prove.
Don's ahead of me a step. Culturally, what is our culture value? Facts, right. But we know, because you're good church people, you're here on a Wednesday at lunchtime. A lot of things in life, it can't be defined by facts. And so one of my favorite little books is by Alistair McGrath, Doubting. I think we did this ages ago on a Wednesday study. And he has a wonderful chapter in here called Doubt and Certainty. And he talks about the myth of certainty. Now, we use language in ways that overlap meaning. And so if I had asked you, are you certain that Jesus rose from the dead, because you're a good Baptist on a Wednesday Bible study, you go, I'm certain, 100% sure that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead. That's confidence. That's actually not certainty, because certainty in a very specific way is what can I prove? And so none of us in this room can prove today that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Now, it's not blind, it's not make-believe, right? So he talks about Disney and make-believe. That's not what we mean by beliefs. Because he uses this example, and it's a wonderful helpful. He says, look, 2 + 2 = 4. That's a fact. We can prove that. The sum is greater than the parts. That's a fact. We can prove that. He says those are things that are provable, and they're helpful to a certain degree, but nobody's life has actually ever been changed by 2 + 2 = 4. He says the most important things in life are things that are shaped around belief. And he uses the example of love between people. He talks about spouses. So I am very, very confident that Allison loves me. She brought me lunch today. She puts up with my faults. She puts up with me using her in sermon illustrations. She does all sorts of things to show me that she loves me. But I cannot actually read her mind. Probably the only way I can know with 100% certainty that she loved me is if I could read her thoughts. And we don't actually know how to do that yet, do we? So, I have to take the evidence that I've been given and formulate a belief about how do I interpret the evidence in her life in a way that brings meaning to our relationship. And I'm fairly confident that I can interpret that as she loves me. Now, when you say, which is more important to you, Taylor, 2 + 2 = 4, or that Allison loves you, guess which one I'm going to say all the time? Yeah, that Allison loves me. And so facts are important, but all statements concerning the meaning of life require statements of belief. This is why I don't always use slides, because I'm never good at keeping up with them. So we got my wife loves me. Here's the thing about our faith in God. The object of our faith is a person, the self-giving, self-revealing, triune God. So as Christians, it's not make-believe. We have good reasons for what we believe, but we cannot prove it with absolute certainty. There's good reasons for believing in the resurrection. We're going to talk in a second about good reasons why we should believe the disciples' testimony. But that's not the same thing as, because really they might have had original evidence. They did have original evidence, right? The disciples saw Jesus. That's evidence. But have you and I seen the risen Lord physically? No. If you have, come talk to me afterwards. Right? And Jesus even said, blessed are those who believe and yet haven't seen. Right? It's faith. It's belief. It doesn't mean it's blind. Blind faith is not what we have as Christians. We have reasoned faith. And so there's good reasons for it, but it's not the same thing as certainty. So this is why we say, I believe, or we believe. It is belief, but everything in life is belief. In fact, if you say Jesus didn't rise from the dead, that's also a belief statement, because those people also were not there. Right? Most things in life that are beyond our personal experience are belief statements. Life is filled with belief statements. And Christians just have a specific belief. We believe that God reveals himself. We can't just think up God, certainly not the God who reveals himself as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so we believe God has revealed himself to us. Now, when he gets in, this is where he starts to stretch it. He gets a lot out of a preposition. But he says faith for the Christian is marked by mystery because faith is about proximity. He uses the example of the stars, right? If we just, all we know about the stars is they're twinkling up there. You got Pumbaa in The Lion King. He has his theory of how stars are. Go back and watch it. But if you know more and more about stars, it doesn't actually diminish the mystery, does it? I remember listening to a podcast one time where an astronomer is talking about really black matter, and he's just going into it. And the more he talks about it, the more you're like, what in the world are they talking about? And he really gets into it, and he says, the more we learn, the more we realize we just don't know much at all, right? This proximity creates mystery. How much more so the God of all creation? That as we draw near to him, yes, we have a creed. Yes, it gives these kind of basic outlines of our faith, but the closer we draw to the content of our faith, who is God, the more mystery there is, right? Of his goodness, of his love, of his mercy, of his grace. And this requires faith. And that faith, that belief, is a leaning into. It's not just an assenting to certain doctrines. And so he uses the example that every preacher, you've all heard this illustration a lot of times, haven't you? He gives the most detailed description of this guy that I've ever read. So I don't know where he got all his stuff. This story has gotten shortened through the years of just the guy walking across the thing with the wheelbarrow and are you going to get in? That's the difference between, we always talk about that belief and faith, but really we might think of intellectual assent versus belief. But he tells the story of his manager actually got on his back. So he's walked across the tightrope many, many times. And his manager at one point gets on his back and he walks across. How many of you would do that? The older I get, the less I trust anybody with that kind of stuff. When Alice and I were young and foolish, we did some of those big zip lines in a foreign country where they don't make you sign any waivers or anything. And we even did some rock climbing like that one time. And the older I get, I think, I've met a lot of people, and I've just learned I probably don't trust most of them enough to do that, and yet here I am with a stranger. Right? This is belief, that when we say we believe in, what we're saying is we think this is the way to life. And we are laying our life on it. That's what the creed is inviting us to. It's not a mental, oh yeah, check, 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 check. It is, we believe that this is where real life is found, where real meaning is found. And so he says, we're not here to merely understand doctrine. What we are after is to meet the God this creed confesses. I mean, it's a big belief to believe God can be found, right? He can be met, that we can know him. So there's the belief. He says, we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all that is seen and all that is unseen. So if we didn't know the scriptures, we may not hear the echoes of the Shema, but the Shema is what? Say it with me. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Now, what we describe the belief in God as one is what? What's the technical term for that? Monotheism. And that is opposed to what? Polytheism. So polytheism is the belief in what? Many gods. Now, it's hard for us because most often when we're arguing belief in the one God, he points out that we're arguing with whom in modern world? Atheists, people who believe in no gods. And there probably were some atheists in old days, but not very many. They were definitely in the minority. Most people believed in a spiritual world, but they believed there were many gods. And it's fascinating here because what does this mean? Well, Israel is saying something. One, God is singular. God is one, not many. And that means God is sufficient. We may not think about this as much as they would have. He talks about, though, you have gods of all sorts of different things, right? So how many of you can remember enough Sunday school lessons? We had Baal as one of the gods that shows up in the Old Testament a lot. Anybody remember what Baal was the god of? A lot of times like thunder, he was the god that brought the rains, and so he's helpful for the crops, right? Because you need the rains and the thunder and all that stuff. But you also had other gods. Asherah was a fertility god, right? So if you're wanting your animals to have babies, or you want to have a baby, you might offer a sacrifice to that god. Right? You had gods for different things, and so if you needed different things, it's like going, to the market, an old market. Could you get everything in one shop? No, you had to go to a lot of different gods. And Israel is insisting something different. There are not many gods, there's one God. So God is sufficient. God is the one who can meet all of our needs. God is the one who can provide all things for us. So that's the case. That's what Israel is coming to believe, because God is revealing himself as this. But we certainly can remember the story of Elijah, Mount Carmel, calling fire down. He was not confronting pagans in that story. Whom was he confronting? Israelites. They had already been given the 10 Commandments. They'd already been given the Shema. They were already supposed to be worshiping their God as the one true God. Why do you think it was that Israel was so often tempted to worship other gods?
They intermarried with them, and Ahab was a terrible king at that time, at Jezebel.
So intermarriage is one thing, right? Because they brought in influential people in their lives who believe in other gods. And we are, again, from the very beginning of this lesson, we're always more influenced by our culture than we realize. And so if they're believing in other gods, well, maybe there's something to it. And so maybe we need to hedge our bets a little bit. It's not that they gave up totally on believing on God alone, but it's kind of like your market, your retirement account. If you go to see your financial advisor and you say, hey, I heard about this company and I think it's the next big thing. I want to sell everything I have to buy just this one stock. What is your financial advisor going to say to you?
Good idea.
Don't do it. Why is that a bad idea?
If you lose, you lose big.
If you lose, you lose big. Okay, so now back up with me to the ancient world where all of my neighbors believe in many gods. But I am saying, or at least the people in my community are saying, there's only one God. And we say, okay, we're not going to give sacrifices to any of those other gods. We're only going to make sacrifices to our God. Why do you think they are tempted to keep going back to the other gods? If you lose big.
Let's cover all bases.
Let's cover all our bases. Now, it's easy for us, modern day Americans who are Christians, who don't have little idols in our houses. We're not making sacrifices to foreign gods to think, oh, yeah, we don't have a problem with idolatry. But are we always good at thinking God is sufficient? No. What are other things we often depend upon besides God?
Money.
Ourselves, money, status, power. Yeah. Anybody tempted to trust in politics? You say no, but we sure do put a lot of emphasis on it, right? And so he gives us a good definition of idolatry. Idolatry is treating something that is not God as if it is. Okay, and we're talking in a second about how we might do that. But it's also treating God like something that is not God. There's two different ways to commit idolatry here. So idolatry is really when we treat anything like God that isn't God. And I have found that I think one of the easiest ways to figure out if something in your life is becoming an idol is to ask, am I open to hearing criticism about whatever it is? Because, right, the only being above criticism is whom? God. Now, we may not like what God is doing. God gives us permission to lament and complain. That's not what I mean. But at the end of the day, we know we can complain about God, but who's the problem with when we complain about God? Us. I mean, he gives us permission to do this. He's loving and caring. But at the end of the day, we know that's an argument we're going to lose, isn't it? Because God is perfect. Everything else is what? Fallible, sinful. And yet, there are many things in our life that we think are above criticism. Your own opinions. If somebody comes and criticizes kind of your point of view, if you are never, ever, ever, ever open to the possibility, I know it's a small possibility, but the possibility that you might be wrong, guess what? You've made a God of your opinions. If we've seen this in the world, right? We get so entrenched in our political positions that if your political positions or your favorite politician you find above criticism, there is a good chance that you have made a god of them. Your family. I mean, what if somebody makes the suggestion that you are putting too much really attention on your own family to the harm of other people? Can that happen in life? Yeah, I mean, I've seen people do great harm in the community all because they say they're defending their own family. You've maybe been on the losing end of some of that on occasion. And yet, if my own family is above criticism, I have made a god of my family. And here's the danger about idolatry. Most of us don't make an idol of bad things. It's not like we're out there thinking, I think I'm going to start worshiping murder. Right? Most of us know not to do that. But we take the good gifts of God and we treat them as if they are God himself. And the creed calls us back over and over again. Remember, we believe in one God. There's only one God. The other way is to treat God as if he's not God. And that's really God like a mascot, God like a coach. We even Jesus uses the language of God as friend, but God is more than our buddy. And so I know we can all do this. What we want is just enough of God to make our lives a little bit better, right? But if we really know God, this is every time a church decides to read through the Bible, I always think, man, this is dangerous, dangerous stuff. Or just the Gospels. I don't know about you, but every time I read through the Gospel, it causes me trouble. Right? One, Jesus just talks about religious people in ways that bother me all the time. And I'm like, I'm a professional religious person, God, and I can take it easy on us. Right? Because God isn't in my life in an advisory capacity. He's not just there to make some suggestions. He's not just an influencer so that I'll click like on what he says. He is God. And if he says something that contradicts the way I'm living, what am I called to do? Yeah, change. I'm called to yield to him. And so a lot of times we can keep God's sorts of things in our lives and think that makes us faithful, but God isn't an accessory to our life. He's God. And so this is one of the ways that we can commit adultery. That would also be a form of idolatry, but I'm ending our marriage earlier. We got adultery. It's a challenging day today. Pray for me. All right. So we believe in one God, and we believe the Father, the Almighty. So that language kind of goes together. Sometimes there's people today who don't like the language of Father in there. That's often because they've had bad fathers, and let's just say out loud, there are some really rotten fathers in the world. And so it's easy for us to see how people who've experienced great harm from their earthly fathers may struggle to call God Father. But this is the revealed language in the ancient world. They're not really thinking of this. Notice there's no mother figure in Judaism or Christianity. You don't have cosmic marriage between two gods. God is just Father. And it's really understood as he is the source of all things. And so that's the language. We talked even Sunday a little bit about God is, because he's Father, doesn't mean he's gendered. It means he's the source of all things. And so, again, I am one of those people who says this is the revealed language of Scripture. So even if we have trouble with it, that's really the trouble is with us. We need to open ourselves up to not judging God based upon our bad experiences with fathers, but perhaps judge our bad experiences with fathers based on God. It's okay to say, my father was a bad father, because I know that's not what God the Father intended for fatherhood to look like. Right? Where the judgment goes the other direction, not that way. Now, again, I know that sometimes those wounds are so deep, it doesn't mean it's easy. But the point here is that God is the source. Also, this language of the Almighty, he's supreme. So God is power itself, isn't he? I mean, everything is made because he is. He's before all things. And so for us, everything we experience in life outside of God has a beginning. The source is in God. And even what we experience in life is from him, that we don't make it up on our own. Can we make something out of absolutely nothing? No, but God can, because within himself he has the power to do those things. That God is the maker of all things, and that includes you. So the language here in the creed, he's the maker of heaven and earth, of things seen and unseen. So he makes, that pretty much includes everything. That's a very fancy way of saying God made everything. If it's there, he made it, and that includes you. He made us. And so he makes the world for his own enjoyment. He makes the world for purpose. If we might sometimes make something, and we may say it has no purpose, but usually if we make something, even if it doesn't have a pragmatic purpose, What usually is the purpose? Somebody said something over here. Joy. It brings us joy, right? There's joy in the creativity. There's pleasure for our own experience in sharing with others. Something doesn't have to be ultra pragmatic in order to be enjoyable. If that was the case, we wouldn't decorate anything. And yet, how many of you love to decorate stuff? It's okay. It's admitted. I think sometimes we think that's sinful. The Puritans sometimes, there's certain groups of Christians that they thought any kind of decoration was sinful. But a God who makes butterflies, frankly, I think is okay with decoration, right? I mean, that's the fanciest kind of, I mean, it's a bug, right? And yet, it's a beautiful bug. I mean, if you're just thinking, I'm going to make a bug, beetles are probably fine, you know? But God said, beetles are good, but let's see what else we could do. And so, if God does that, it's probably okay for us to decorate them out. In fact, you go anywhere in the world, and if you just leave people to their own devices, what are they going to do? They're going to decorate. They're going to organize things. They're going to build the world up because God made us to do those things. But that also tells us, right, we're made in God's image. This is part of God's very self. He has purpose for us. So this is part of finding meaning in life. Do I have to make up meaning for myself? Or is meaning inherent in the fact that God has made me? He made me. He knows me. The language he uses in here is that he calls us and he sustains us. He calls us to live in community. He calls us to care for one another. There's a reason that our lives are better when we care for one another, because that's one of the reasons God made us. That an isolated life, again, this gets back to technology, mental health. Do you know who researchers consistently find are the happiest people on the planet and really live the longest? Yeah, you. People who go to midweek church meetings. Seriously, if we add food to this, no, I'm serious. This is out of Harvard University. And this is not out of, this isn't just the Bible college down the street that did this study. Because what they find is, we're made for community. And we live in a world where people are surrounded by people and they are all alone. We live in an epidemic of loneliness. And one of the worst things possible for your health is loneliness. And so people who gather together in settings like this, especially people who put food on the table, this would actually make it even healthier for you. And you think, well, have you seen church food, Taylor? It's not that healthy. That seems to be beside the point. Is we are actually leaning into the very purpose that God made us for, which is life together. And part of that is, you just think the pragmatics of that. We know this is Wednesday supper in the summer, which is not normal for us. But if it's our regular Wednesday night crowd, and let's say you come every week, and then all of a sudden you're not there for a couple of weeks, people are going to notice. Right? And because that's what happens in community. And then so they might check on you, and they might discover, whoa, you've been having a tough time. And then they come alongside you and give help to your life. And you all know that actually the joy of helping. I'm looking around this room, you're the people who help each other. And so there's joy and meaning in that. When we isolate ourselves, we lose meaning. You can't actually have meaning all by yourself. Meaning is always based on the relationships in your life. And God gives us the ultimate meaning because he loves us, he's saved us, he gives us purpose, and then he invites us to be in life together with him. So he is the sustainer. And so part of the things that it talks about making, which I thought was a profound kind of step, is that he makes purpose, those unseen and seen things. The world, again, we're always having to have statements of belief. So we live in a world that is becoming increasingly, well, let me take that back. Western culture, it's not the whole world, but Western culture in large part has been shaped by materialism. I don't mean consumerism, it's been shaped by that too. Materialism is the belief that the material is all there is. That if you talk to a materialist about spiritual things, they're like, well, really, that's just chemicals moving around in your brain, making you think stuff, but there's nothing actually beyond the physical. Now, they may call that facts, but at the end of the day, if that's the truth, you got to make some meaningful statements about life. And so if you've read any of the books about what are called the new atheists, they'll say in pretty harsh terms that life has no meaning. They'll say the universe doesn't actually care that you are here. And so when you read all of their stuff, they're coming to a conclusion. If there's nothing spiritual, they're saying life has no meaning. But even that is a statement of belief, isn't it? I mean, there's no way to prove that mathematically. And so they're having to make an inference based on the evidence they have. And again, that's a belief. We believe that life is meaningless. But if we believe there is both physical and spiritual, that there is a God who has revealed himself to us, and part of that revelation is that he has purpose for our lives, which at the very basis of that purpose is simply for us to be in joyful relationship with him. Then we take the exact same evidence, we're all dealing with the same evidence, and we say what? Life has meaning and purpose. Does that meaning come from our own making it up inside of ourselves? It comes from our relationship to God and one another. And the creed reminds us of that. I mean, that really is the good news. And that's good news in every generation. So like we talked about Sunday, we'll close with this. I mean, the reason that women and slaves responded to the gospel at such high rates was in their culture were they told by the people in charge that their lives have much meaning or purpose? Not other than just serving the people in charge. And all of a sudden you have a gospel that says, you are made in the image of God. Really talk about individuality. That's the good news of individuality, isn't it? But also that as an individual, you are now a part of God's family, and you have purpose in that family. Purpose where you have giftedness, purpose where you get to serve others joyfully, freely. It's not forced, it's not compelled. And then also others will serve you. All of this fills our life with meaning. But we get that based upon the fact that we are believing what we have received. This has been given to us. And you see how joining ourselves to that provides a meaning for our lives that we probably can't make up on our own. So this is just the way it works. That I can go, a couple of people were asking me, they were teasing me about going to the Anglican church when I go somewhere. But just here's the good news about the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm a preacher. I don't mind jumping into church wherever I go. It embarrasses Allison every time we go. Because it doesn't matter where we are on the planet. If there's a church meeting, I'm going to walk right in. And I'm going to...
That's not what embarrasses me, it's that you have to talk to them.
I know. So, but here's the thing. I can assume a shared sense of meaning based on something external to me, so that I know we are a part of the family of God. And there's meaning there that I don't have to create. I don't have to stretch. I don't have to negotiate. You just walk in, family of God. Now, we know the family of God's not perfect, so they might be suspicious of me. But in a general sense, this is true. And you don't get that as an isolated soul. You only get it apart. And that's what he gets on the front end of this creed. Well, next week, let's figure out which two chapters we're going to read. 5 and 6, we're going to jump into the Jesus sections. And that is, really there's 3 chapters on Jesus. So let's do this. Next week, let's just do chapter 5, okay? And those of you who are behind can catch up. So chapter 5, we're going to start the Jesus. Jesus is actually 3 chapters here. And so we'll do that. God the Father gives, yep. Yep.
You mentioned the gospel a whole bunch while you're speaking about the creed. I'm a New Time Creed reader.
Yeah.
I grew up Baptist. I grew up believing that the gospel, that I'm saved just because of what Jesus did on the cross.
Yeah.
I don't see the gospel in the creed. I don't see anything
So
necessarily wrong, but I don't see the gospel in the creed.
So when we're using gospel here, it's really the story of Jesus. So we use gospel in Baptist circles a lot of times to mean like the Roman road to salvation, that kind of thing. Paul, when he talks about gospel, so like the passage we read out of Corinthians is a summary statement of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
But when I read the creed, I'm almost thinking, is that
it's a shorthand for that of what's the core narrative of Jesus. So we'll jump into that next week a little bit more deeply.
You're saying it does have it in there.
I'm saying it has the core story of life, death, resurrection of Jesus. So if you ask Paul what the gospel was, Paul's going to say, God has become flesh in the person of Jesus Christ. He died for our sins and he rose again. He upended the powers of sin and death, and he's coming again, and all who put their faith in him, their sins shall be forgiven. They're made a part of the family of God.
Salvation comes from our faith in that. That's
Yeah.
what the Nicene Creed says.
Yeah, so the Nicene Creed is telling that story. It's not necessarily calling to faith. It's the content of the story. Does that make sense?
I'm still struggling with it. It seems to be kind of, let's do another gospel.
But notice what it's saying. It's saying we believe. So we could phrase this in a different way. So, like when I have somebody in the baptistry, and I say, "What is your profession of faith?" and they say, "Jesus Christ is Lord." I mean, that's a very truncated statement of faith, isn't it? So I'm not having them recite the whole story, but in saying Jesus Christ is Lord, it really is a very short sentence to say all that Jesus said about himself, I'm on board with. Jesus Christ is Lord. And the creed is encapsulating that. So it's saying, it's agreeing with Israel, God is one. So what we've gotten to so far is what we're saying is there's one God. It's Israel's God. That this God is the one true God. He's the Father Almighty. So he's Lord over everything. And then he's the maker of all things. So all that's just a statement of orthodoxy that God is the creator. And now we're going to move into who is Jesus. It's going to be in fact, the Nicene Creed is very Trinitarian language. The emphasis in the Nicene Creed, I'm not saying you have to recite the Nicene Creed to be a Christian. The Nicene Creed is a way the early church taught the outline of the content of our faith. So we use the word faith in multiple ways, and so does Paul. So Paul will sometimes mean by faith our trust in God, but he will sometimes mean by faith the content or the object of what we believe in, which is Jesus, the revelation of God that we have in Jesus. Is that? This is weird for Baptists, and I'm not saying we do this.
I see all the truth of Scripture. I don't see the gospel, that our salvation comes from that. We're saying we believe it, but we're not saying that our salvation comes from that belief. So that's the gospel, isn't it?
Yeah, so I mean,
Cross.
he is going to talk about the forgiveness of sins before we get into the end of it. We're not there yet. Just stick with me.
Paul also points out that it is according to the scripture
Yeah.
in chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians. He died for our sins according to the scripture. He was buried. He rose on the third day according to the scripture and was seen by many people.
So think of this as like an outline for the content of the New Testament story. That what we're saying is this is the content of who Jesus is. And so we got to talk about who the Father is so that we can put Jesus in relation to him, and then who the Spirit is and what the Spirit accomplishes. And it is a different way of language than, say, the way evangelicals use it. You just all take comfort. We're not going to get out of this and start reciting the Nicene Creed on Sunday mornings. That's not the goal of this. It's really to say, what is the doctrinal, this is early doctrinal formation. What is the early kind of doctrinal consensus of Christians? So it's a doctrinal statement about who is God, the Father. It's a doctrinal statement about who is Jesus, the Son. It's a doctrinal statement about who is the Holy Spirit and what is the church. And so it's not, when I say that, I don't mean this is the only thing we have to say about Christianity to be mature followers of Jesus. But it is a helpful way of saying, like, what this is helpful for is if somebody comes along and says, Jesus, we're going to talk about this next week. This is why we even have the Nicene Creed. Is there's lots of people who want to say Jesus is kind of divine. They may even say he's divine, but not God. I mean, that's what Jehovah's Witnesses say. Frankly, it's what Mormons say, if you get deep into their theology. And so what the Nicene Creed is saying, no, that's not the gospel we've received. The gospel we received affirms over and over again that Jesus is God, true God of true God. And so that's what it's helping flesh out the doctrinal understanding of the gospel. You don't have to recite, so this is what I mean by faith in the gospel. I don't have to recite this in order to be a Christian. Really what I have to do is call the name of Jesus to be saved. But if I want to know what a Christian believes, like what is the content of that faith, the Nicene Creed and other things like it help explain what is it that we're actually saying about God? What is it that we're actually saying about Jesus? We do this with Baptist life. I mean, we could do the Baptist faith and message too. It's a lot longer than this. And it's going to cover all the same things. And gospel, Paul just sometimes uses gospel in that broader sense. It is the wholeness of what we have received from God, which includes the good news of our salvation. Like, so think of it this way, let's just read this, open to Mark. So Mark's gospel, right, starts, I get there. And if you need to leave, I know we're over time. So Mark's gospel says, the beginning of the good news, which is actually the word gospel. So it says, the beginning of the gospel about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. So he's there using gospel as the beginning of the good news that is this story about Jesus. He's not using gospel right there in the very technical way of, here's how you are saved. Although we can only be saved by knowing, like we do need to know that we need, like the way you're using gospel is a correct way of using gospel. But it is my responding to the good news of Jesus. But the good news of Jesus is his coming, his death, his resurrection, his second coming again. All of that together is the good news of Jesus Christ. It's the content of all that. So language always gets used in multiple ways, and gospel there gets used, we use it in two different ways. Evangelicals have emphasized the way you're talking about it, but like we call them the four gospels, and they're this big story about Jesus. Does that help a little bit? Sort of, yeah. Well, I love the discussion, and I know that we crammed a lot into this one, so I talked a lot. So we'll try to, that's why we'll do one chapter next week and hopefully allow for more discussion. So thanks for being here. We'll see you next week.